Hey, welcome to the Hudson Institute. It's great to see everybody. It's great to be at a place that's done so much great work and research and writing and policy recommendations concerning, I think, the most important alliance today, which is the United States-Japan alliance. And it's fitting, I think, that we're having this discussion in advance of Prime Minister Suga's visit to Washington at the Hudson Institute, as the cherry blossoms are in full bloom. I would say that the U.S.-Japan relationship is also in full bloom as our two nations work together to realize the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, first laid out by former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in December 2012, when he made the following observation: peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Pacific Ocean are inseparable from peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean. Japan, as one of the oldest seafaring democracies in Asia, should play a greater role alongside Australia, India, and the United States in preserving the common good in both regions. Our relationship is in full bloom because two new administrations have already demonstrated that the alliance remains vital if we are to overcome myriad challenges related to Chinese Communist Party aggression, global health, energy security, and climate. Our relationship is in full bloom because the Japanese and American people understand more and more that our two nations and other like-minded liberal democracies must work together to overcome the alternative, authoritarian, mercantilist models to build a better future for generations to come. Our relationship is in full bloom as the Prime Minister Suga and President Biden have already had substantive conversations with Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison in the Quad format that Prime Minister Abe envisioned in 2012. The cherry blossoms are, of course, a beautiful symbol of what Prime Minister Abe once called the miracle that is our alliance. But whereas this year's peak cherry blossom bloom is behind us, the Japan-US alliance is not even close to its peak. And whereas cherry blossoms are fragile, prone as they are to a late season freeze, the Japan-US alliance has already proven its extraordinary durability. We have a great panel for this discussion in advance of Prime Minister Suga's upcoming historic visit to Washington. It is a privilege to welcome to Hudson Emma Chanlett-Avery, Toshihiro Nakayama, and Zack Cooper. Emma Chanlett-Avery is a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, where she focuses on U.S. relations with Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Thailand, and Singapore. Ms. Chanlett-Avery joined the Congressional Research Service in 2003 through the Presidential Management Fellowship. She also worked in the Office of Policy Planning as a Harold Rosenthal Fellow. She is a member of the Mansfield Foundation U.S.-Japan Network for the Future, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Japan-America Society of Washington, and the 2016 recipient of the Cato Prize. Ms. Chanlett-Avery received an MA in International Security Policy from Columbia University and a BA in Russian Studies from Amherst College. Nakayama-san is a professor of American politics and foreign policy at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. He is also a senior adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Past experiences include special assistant at the Permanent Mission of Japan to the United Nations, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, Japan scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and an advisor to the Ministry of Defense. He has written 2 books and numerous articles on American politics, foreign policy, and international relations. He is a recipient of the Nakasone Yasuhiro Incentive Award in 2014. And last but not least, Zack Cooper is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. strategy and alliances in Asia. He also co-directs the Alliance for Securing Democracy and teaches at Georgetown and Princeton. Dr. Cooper previously worked on staff at the Pentagon and the White House. He holds a BA from Stanford University and an MPA and PhD from Princeton University. The theme tonight is really, what are our thoughts about how to take full advantage of this relationship that is in full bloom, and how to build a better future for generations of Americans and Japanese citizens to come. Each will open with brief remarks concerning the most pressing challenges, the greatest opportunities, and the top priorities for the Alliance. And then we'll follow with a discussion among ourselves to expound on those points and raise others that are relevant to this historic visit and the priorities for our Alliance. And so, Emma, welcome, and please begin.
Thank you so much for that very enthusiastic welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Because I am a member of the Congressional Research Service, I do need to issue a little disclaimer that these views are my own, certainly not the views of the US Congress. I'm going to talk a little bit first about sort of the big headline of the Quad, because that's sort of the big shiny object very early in the Biden presidency. On March 12th, President Biden convened the first leader-level quadrilateral security dialogue meeting, virtually, obviously, among the leaders of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. The biggest announcement was about this vaccine distribution pledge to Southeast Asia, as well as the broader Indo-Pacific, in a very sort of collaborative way, combining US and Japanese financing, Australian logistics, and Indian manufacturing. And since then, administration officials have said that the focus of the Quad will indeed be on these sorts of transnational issues. COVID, obviously, climate change, counterterrorism, infrastructure efforts, really a focus on delivering common goods to the region. The Quad works well now because leaders of all of these countries have seen sort of a downturn in their country's relations with China over the past year. Japan is concerned about the pace of incursions and the presence of Chinese ships in the Senkaku Islands. Australia was facing trade sanctions from China after inquiring about an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. And India and China had their own deadly battles along their Himalayan border. So it will work that all these leaders could coalesce right now to come together in the Quad. I think there are still a lot of questions about the durability and the flexibility of the Quad. And I really do think that the bedrock of this experiment, if you will, is the strength of the US-Japan alliance. It really undergirds this grouping and how it will work. And I think in lots of ways, the Quad is sort of a continuation and an expansion of a lot of the things that the US and Japan already do together. Of course, the US and Japan and Australia increasingly have worked to build security cooperation together, and they included India included Australia in the Malabar naval exercises last year. I think there's plenty more to come in terms of climate change cooperation between the Biden and Suga administrations. We may see some announcements in the upcoming summit between the two leaders. Japan and the United States have long focused on global health initiatives together, and then we'll obviously see an uptick of that given the ongoing pandemic. But I also think it's important to look at some of the challenges of the Quad and indeed of the US-Japan alliance. There have been some criticisms that have come out, or concerns rather, about which direction the Quad is going to take. And one of them, of course, is the lack of an economic component or a robust economic component. And I think that's something, Japan was quite disappointed when the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that's going to be a continuing challenge as we move forward. I also think that there's some concern that the Quad, with these four countries, can't speak in one voice on some of the issues. And among those are human rights and democratic governance. And this also may prove to be a challenge in some ways, or at least a tension in the US-Japan relationship. President Biden and his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, have really placed foreign policy, or rather placed human rights at the center of their foreign policy. And while Japan has been stronger in its condemnation of some of China's human rights violations, specifically in Xinjiang, as well as in Hong Kong, it has not been willing, for example, to sign on to the sanctions that the United States and its European partners were willing to recently. And I also think there could be concerns over the way we approach Southeast Asia. Japan doesn't have the same tradition of speaking out against human rights violations, and as a result, probably has much stronger relations with some of the countries in Southeast Asia. But will Japan be willing to speak out against, the repression of freedoms in Vietnam, or evidence of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, or abuse of power in Bangkok, for example? And will the United States, in the regional forums, expect Japan to back it up on some of these claims? I think that's yet to be seen. Another criticism of the Quad, potentially, is that it's exclusive in some ways. It is defined by these 4 places. And where that really raises a lot of questions is about South Korea. South Korea is also a vibrant democracy in the region. It also has maritime interests, yet it is not a part of the Quad. And that may be a Seoul's choice. But also the issue of trilateral relations has come up early on in the Biden administration. I think in the trip to the region, where Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin visited Seoul and Tokyo as their first foreign trip overseas, there was some pressure, quiet pressure, but definitely an emphasis on trying to get the relationship between Seoul and Tokyo right so that we can have effective trilateral coordination in the future. And then I just want to mention one other thing, and that's the wild card that we're not really talking about right now, which is the possibility of a North Korean provocation and what that would mean. That's not particularly relevant to the Quad, that group of countries, but certainly could be a driver of trilateral cooperation and drive the need for more trilateral cooperation if there is some sort of missile test or nuclear device test in the coming months. I'm going to end there, but I look forward to a discussion with all of you.
Hey, thank you, Emma. Professor Nakayama.
Well, thank you, General McMaster, for that kind introduction, and thank the Hudson Institute for having me here. I'm going to talk a bit about, since our Prime Minister is going to visit DC, I'm going to talk a bit about our perception of the Biden sort of foreign policy and his team. And I think it's not a secret that Japan was a bit nervous about President Biden and the Biden, sort of the outlook of the Biden foreign policy. I think this nervousness was based on this preconceived notion that that Democrats are not reliable on national security. There's some background to it. The Japan passing in the Clinton era. During the Obama era, trying to manage U.S.-Sino relations through this G2 conception, at least initially. And sort of you contrast that with the unambiguous toughness of the Trump China policy. So, the toughness of Mr. Trump and his China policy was in fact a reflection of the fact that, the whole China thing was changing in the United States. It wasn't just a Trump phenomenon. I think it was more broader. But I think you cannot deny the fact that the Trump administration sort of embraced this toughness without any sort of hesitation. And I think the Trump team sort of defined China as a revisionist power and treated its intent as being sometimes sort of adversarial. I don't think it totally succeeded in formulating a durable sort of coalition to China, counter China's rise. But and in fact, because of its toughness, I think it sometimes alienated potential partners and allies. But I think this unambiguous message of the Trump administration was welcomed in Japan compared to other sort of Western democracies, and but seeing sort of the Biden administration taking off and sort of putting this restoration of American internationalism as a main agenda, and also stating that they're also going to be tough on China, I think this this nervousness totally evaporated. As a result of series of events, we started to realize that something different was going on within the Biden team. Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense mentioned China as a challenger and a potential threat in a prepared statement in the confirmation hearing. The term pacing challenger signal that U.S. is sort of preparing for a long-term competition with China. You know how sort of picky we Japanese are in sort of examining these words, right, to describe China. And also, since the mid-March, you had this sort of diplomatic sort of offensive with the Quad, as Emma sort of described just now. The two plus twos, both in Tokyo and Seoul. The visit of Secretary Austin to India, and the sort of the U.S.-Sino contact in Alaska, and going to Europe. China was one of the important agendas, and also this forward leaning on Asia policy. It wasn't just that it was forward leaning, but I think it was sophisticated as well. It wasn't just about confronting and containing China, but it was trying to manage the competition with China in a way which would benefit the U.S. Surrounding China with the desirable rules and norms with partners and allies. And also the fact that there's a sort of a democratic regression going on around the world, that America is going to be at the center and trying to sort of push back that regression. And that message was quite clear. So in these circumstances, Prime Minister Abe is going to sort of visit Washington as a first foreign leader. And that sort of symbolic meaning is quite clear. I commend the hard work of my colleagues in Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Embassy in DC. But I think, and I'm sure they've worked hard on it. But I think there's a structural reason, and I think it symbolizes what's going on in the region. If a Biden sort of team administrations see China on the scale of this cooperation, competition, and confrontation, and in recent years tilting more towards confrontation, U.S.-Japan relations and U.S.-Japan alliance, and if Asia is to be a focus of American foreign policy, Japan is a natural sort of partner. And I think Prime Minister Abe sort of symbolizes that. This visit by Prime Minister is pretty important, but since both
and you said Prime Minister Abe, but you mean Suga. Sorry.
Yes, Prime Minister.
Yeah, if you want to just sorry, it's Sarah popping in here. If you just want to re-say that part.
Okay, so this visit by Prime Minister Suga is critically important, but since this two teams are relatively new, and they're still dealing with the coronavirus domestically, I think the visit itself is going to be largely symbolic. And of course, the meeting of head of states sort of tends to be that. There's no acute issues that has to be solved at the sort of leadership level between our two countries, I think. So I think the context of this meeting is critically important. I think we're at this, how should I say, sort of the present at the creation moment in terms of dealing with China. I think the democracies around the world are pretty aware that we are at the sort of this starting point with this long and strategic competition with China. In fact, it may have already begun. And we're trying to sort of draw that sort of strategic map. And rather than sort of going into the details, I think the two sort of leaders, President Biden and Prime Minister Suga, should shore the strategic outlook. The follow-up should be sort of done at the sort of the 2+2, I think, which is already scheduled, later this year, and at the working level. Japan has to be bold for sure, and America has to be a resident power without showing any hesitation. So the purpose of this visit is to show to the region and to show to other partners and allies in the region that U.S.-Japan alliance is on a firm sort of ground, and that we're sort of focused on sort of defending liberal and open and international order in our region. On our side, we sort of used to call this alliance the Alliance of Hope. I didn't quite like that because sometimes it could sound cheesy, right? But if you think about what's going on in our region, and if you think about how long this strategic competition would be, I do actually think that Alliance of Hope is an apt term. And I hope we all can work on sort of making this Alliance of Hope better. So I'll end here. Thanks.
Nakayama-san, thank you so much. We could all use a little hope here, right? I think we're all emerging from various traumas.
Sure.
And I think your point, that there are no real issues to resolve, which I think gives a lot of space for a positive agenda, a hopeful agenda, and an ambitious agenda, not just in connection with the competition with China, but our own vision, right, for security and prosperity across the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much for those great comments. And Dr. Cooper, over to you.
Well, thank you, General McMaster. It's really a pleasure to be here and appreciate all the work that you and Hudson have done on the Alliance. It's so important and it's wonderful to have more places in Washington that are really doing really detailed work on the Alliance. So fantastic to be here, especially alongside Nakayama-san and Emma, who are both Japan's greatest experts on the United States and the United States' greatest expert on Japan. So we're lucky to have them. So I'll just add a couple of embellishments on what they mentioned, which is that, I think actually the US-Japan alliance is pretty lucky. In fact, if you went back over the 4 years that we just went through and you said, which alliance is in the best shape? The answer pretty clearly to me is the US-Japan alliance. And it's not even close, right? Certainly nothing else in Asia is in the kind of state the US-Japan alliance is. And certainly the European alliances have had some struggles. So the US-Japan alliance is in a very good position. And look, we've had a pretty solid couple of weeks and couple of months, right? As everyone has mentioned, we've now had a Quad leaders meeting followed by the 2+2, which was the first visit out of the country by the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, plus the first, major foreign meeting for both of them. And now we're getting a national security advisors meeting trilaterally in Annapolis, as well as the first major summit in Washington. So I think if you're sitting in Tokyo, you've got to feel pretty confident with the direction things are going. And oh, by the way, you just solved the host nation support issue, which had been a lasting challenge. And so exactly as everyone has mentioned, now the question is, what's the agenda going forward? I think we've done the hard things that were potentially problematic looking backward, the host nation support agreement being number one. And we've had the introductory meetings, or we're about to have the last of them between the president and the prime minister. And so now the question is, what does the alliance actually want to specifically do? And I think this is actually a tougher question than many of us assume, given how good the situation is that the alliance is broadly in. And I think there are three reasons, and I'll just go through them briefly. The first is that in both Tokyo and Washington, increasingly there are domestic challenges that are taking focus away from international issues. And that's normal, but I think that's going to be a challenge in both capitals. Second, I'll walk into each of these in a bit more detail. Economic strategy, mainly here for the United States. I think Japan has done a pretty good job piecing together its economic approach without the US and TPP. But the US has to figure out what its plan is. And I don't think we've seen that yet. And then finally, I think on the defense relationship, we've seen a lot of good talk, but not that much movement. And so we're really at the point where we need to see some movement. So let me just walk into each of those three very briefly. So on the domestic side, there's no question that for both governments, the top priority, right, is the health of their people and the economies that their leaders are in charge of. And so I think that has to be the number one priority. But look, also, we're in a pretty different domestic political situation in Tokyo than we've been in for some time, right? I think a lot of Americans have been quite used to having Prime Minister Abe in a situation where he was really unchallenged and largely unconcerned about some of the domestic political challengers, and could focus on international issues. And it's quite clear that Yoshihide Suga is going to be in a bit of a different situation, especially over the next year. So there are domestic challenges in Tokyo that are going to require some time and energy. And I think there are domestic challenges in the United States that increasingly are calling the Biden team to focus back at home. This is why everyone's saying, the United States can't focus as much on democracy abroad until it gets its own house in order. Well, if that takes a little bit for the United States to get its own house in order, then it's going to be a little while for the United States to be able to engage with the kind of energy abroad that I think it needs to have. So this domestic focus, I think, is going to be a bit of a challenge going ahead. The second issue is economic strategy. And here, this isn't a Japanese problem. In fact, Japan has pushed forward, I think, with remarkable effort and momentum to get the CPTPP through, despite the United States pulling out. But my view is, at the moment, it's not clear to me that the Biden team has a clear economic strategy for the region. And look, it's not their fault alone. I wasn't convinced that the Trump team had a clear economic strategy for the region either, because without TPP, the US doesn't have a lot of options for how to more deeply engage, right? And here the challenge is political in Washington. It's hard to imagine the United States re-entering CPTPP easily. And we've heard some pretty direct words from the Secretary of State about his reassessment of trade deals and whether they make sense for the American people. But at the same time, it does make me worried that it's possible that Beijing is actually more serious about entering the CPTPP than the United States is about re-entering those negotiations. And that's just not the right situation for the US to be in. We have to match our economic strategy in the region to our other approaches on security and technology and governance. And so I think we actually need Japan's help here to put together this economic strategy. And then the final issue is the details on the defense relationship. So almost 10 years ago now, Barack Obama in Australia announced the pivot to Asia. I think if you go back and you look in detail at what has happened since then, you'll actually find there's been much less done on the pivot than most of us would have expected. And in fact, on the US-Japan relationship, we're still not pushing forward, I think, with the kind of energy that I would like to see. So there are a lot of hard issues on the defense relationship regarding Taiwan, regarding ground-based missile forces, use of bases, which have been talked about for quite a long time, but where we frankly just haven't seen the kind of momentum that I think we need. So those are three issues that are going to be a challenge for the incoming team. They're not going to get solved in this first visit, but I think it's critical that Biden and Suga put together a plan for how to overcome those issues. And I'll just end with something that I think each of you has mentioned already, which is, the danger here is that this meeting is largely symbolic and that we don't maintain the momentum in the relationship. It has tremendous momentum, but that means we need to be even more ambitious about what the agenda should be. And so I hope the two leaders come together and put out a very ambitious agenda and a roadmap for accomplishing it, because as you all said, the US-Japan alliance is probably more important now than it's ever been. So this is no time for us to rest on our laurels. So thank you so much for having me, and really looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Hey, Zach, thanks to you, and thanks to all of you. And I think all of us are of the same mind here. It's a great relationship. Let's not take it for granted. How do we keep the momentum going? And so along those lines, maybe we'll begin with one of the points you made, Zach, and also Nakayama-san mentioned, and Emma did as well, which is really what are the economic opportunities here, right? We are emerging from a global recession associated with the pandemic. We have these interconnected problems of climate and energy security, right? And then also, if you look across the Indo-Pacific, and especially reaching out to India, where you have these interconnected problems that have also involved, health security, water security, and food security. And so, I think there's tremendous opportunity there. But what do you think some of the opportunities are in these areas, in the U.S.-Japan relationship in particular, what are the nascent opportunities that could be scaled up, that we've already begun to act on? I'm thinking in connection with U.S. LNG exports as a real element of energy security for Japan, and the need to to transition away from coal. I'm thinking about really working together with Japan, who's worked so hard, on infrastructure development across the Pacific region, on not only renewables but maybe next generation nuclear, which I know is tough on the 10th anniversary of the disaster. So what are your thoughts on economic opportunities? Zach, we'll begin with you, and then just open it up for everyone else's comments.
It's such an important question. So my thought on this is that I think the Quad has actually shown a bit of a way forward on this. And look, the Biden team should get a huge amount of credit. It is really hard to do anything in government, especially doing it quickly and right after you've come into office. And in less than 2 months, they put together a leaders meeting of the Quad, and they actually had a deliverable, right? And that's pretty remarkable. And it was a deliverable that I think was exactly right in substance and in messaging, right? The vaccine initiative, it delivers a positive agenda in Southeast Asia, which is the most critical region, I think, for the US and Japan at the moment. It does it without focusing on China, and I really enjoyed that the joint statement, in fact, didn't mention China at all. And it pushes back really directly against this constant claim that we've heard for much of the last decade that even after the Quad was created, that it just never really delivered beyond humanitarian assistance and disaster relief over just a couple of years. And here we have a strategy for the Quad to deliver. And I think that's the same thing we have to do economically on a broader set of issues. And I think the obvious next place for the US and Japan to push the Quad is in infrastructure, right? It's quite clear, I think, now that the Chinese promises on the Belt and Road Initiative are not going to come true in many countries. And even when some of the money starts flowing, it's not going to be the amount of money that a lot of countries expected. And so there's going to be a deep infrastructure need globally, but certainly in Southeast Asia. And I think this is one of these areas where the US and Japan have to show that we weren't just pushing back against the Belt and Road, that actually we have something positive to bring to the table. And infrastructure is a great area. So, I would look for infrastructure to be one of the main areas that the Quad is going to focus. And I think, of course, the US and Japan are, just given their financing capabilities, the top two within the Quad that are going to be active in that arena. So I think for me, that's the top priority, along with figuring out what this long-term plan is for trade deals in the region.
Great.
I will just add on top of what Zach just laid out in a more comprehensive way. I think there are some areas that economists and trade experts have identified, these somewhat smaller scale but still very important digital trade deals, similar to the one that the United States concluded with Japan under the last administration. Those are going to be important, and we can build on those with economies in the region. And beyond that, I think that clean energy and clean energy technology could also be an area where the United States and Japan cooperate quite a bit. I think that this whole issue of climate and energy is actually going to be possibly one of the defining characteristics here. Japan is going to face probably some pressure to stop financing coal plants overseas, as they have been doing with some of their development assistance. That was an element of tension under the Obama administration as well. And also to come up with more ambitious targets under the Paris deal. President Biden is convening a climate summit, I believe, in April, I believe the 22nd, somewhere around there. And there's probably going to be some pressure, not just on Japan, but on other developed economies as well, to align their targets more closely with what the EU has decided to do. We'll see. Japan, as you mentioned, the reluctance to embrace nuclear power is going to make it harder to achieve those goals. But it is going to be an area, I think, where Biden and Suga can cooperate quite a bit.
Great. Nakayama-san.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree with Zach that sort of the economic and trade component of the Indo-Pacific policy is missing at the moment, especially on the U.S. side, because U.S. has backed down from this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is not just a simple trade deal. It was about U.S. and Japan together trying to uphold a very sort of progressive and high-spec trade rule, which would sort of hold a desirable sort of order in this region. And it was a tragic that sort of U.S. backed off. I think the Japanese position is that we're still waiting for U.S. to sort of come back. But if you look at the sort of the political climate right now in the U.S., that seems more and more difficult. And I think that's partly as a result of America First sort of outlook of the world, and also this middle class foreign policy. There's some sort of a continuation there, I think. And I sort of praised in my initial remarks, the state of the alliance. But as sort of Zack outlined, there are some worries as well. And one of the worries that we see is that this sort of the tendency in the U.S. that the sort of the Biden team calls the middle class foreign policy that makes sense to the middle class. Right? What does that mean if you apply that to East Asia or to China policy? If it is just about Buy America, it is really bad. If you can somehow connect this, the middle class foreign policy to issues like supply chain security, I think it would be great. Yeah. But the worry is that it seems more and more likely that it is about sort of American people in general. I'm not talking about the strategic community, but American sort of body politic, American people in general are not quite forward-leaning on America playing a aggressive and an active role in international affairs. So a Biden team realizes that you have to convince the American people first in order to sort of sustain this long commitment to East Asia. So, and I may be a bit overly cynical about it, but if you sort of dig into the reason why US came out with this quad, the 2+2s and other visits, right? It was to show the American people that America is not doing this alone. There's many partners and many alliances, and it is not just about American internationalism. It's an alliance effort. So in a way, it's a realization that America is not fully on board on playing an active role in international affairs, and we see that, and we see the necessity of us playing a more positive role in it. So I may sort of have veered off from the economic side of things, but those are worries that we see. Generally, I think sort of the Biden team's of outlook of East Asia, and the fact that they're trying to revive American internationalism is a welcome. But I think there's another side to it, and that is a bit of a worry for us.
So what I'd like to do is follow up with you and then open this up to general comments as well. I think CPTPP is dead, right? I hate to break the news, but I think of course, if Secretary Clinton had been elected, she says she was going to get out as well. And I think what we have seen, obviously, is a backlash against unchecked globalization. And the tremendous loss of jobs in manufacturing in the United States associated with that, right? And the promises by China to play by the rules and then not playing by the rules, and then squeezing U.S. companies and workers out of jobs, out of the global market with the subsidies to companies. I mean, Huawei is a great example, $120 billion of subsidies for that company. But so that's the reality, and I think there was this shift back. But I think there's opportunity, right? There are opportunities to take parts of CPTPP. This is what I wanted to ask you. What can be done in a concrete way in issues like data standards, right? Areas that are very, very important to maintaining fair competition and reciprocal competition in the emerging data-driven global economy. Can you think of other concrete opportunities in critical supply chains? Our colleagues, Nadia Shadlow and Arthur Herman, just had a great piece today on batteries, ion lithium batteries and rare earths, and how the Chinese have got a lock on a lot of that supply chain, including the manufacturing as well as the various components that are critical to renewables, for example. So Zach and Emma both, right? You mentioned infrastructure, right? So do you have any concrete ideas in mind? Japan obviously invests in infrastructure in Southeast Asia and across the Indo-Pacific in a way that actually dwarfs Chinese investments. Is there a way to make that more purposeful? We're talking about the need for both energy security and the reduction of man-made carbon emissions. And I think a great experimental place for that is India, right? Because I mean, if no matter what we do in carbon emission reductions, it's not going to matter, right? If China, India, and Africa, don't match that. So we need real solutions that are economically viable in developing economies, right? This could be a great project, for the Quad. It could be a great project for the U.S. and Japan to help make India succeed in both addressing the severe climate and environmental issues and related, food and water security issues, by the way, and doing so in a way that still gives them abundant access to energy so they can grow their economy and lift people out of poverty. So that would be my idea. I would put like that top on the agenda right there. But any other sort of concrete ideas that we would want to land in Secretary Blinken's inbox and be part of the agenda for this invigorating, right, the economic aspect of the partnership?
So I have a couple of thoughts, and I know Emma has a lot of expertise on this too. So I think we have to think both about the offensive and the defensive part of this economic cooperation. So in some ways, I actually think the defensive element is easier, and there's some low-hanging fruit there that I don't think we have yet picked. So what I mean by defensive is, how do we protect our supply chains against the threat of coercion, right, using those supply chains and holding them at risk? And here, just as you mentioned, rare earth minerals are a prime area where we've already seen this used, right, back in 2010. And we've seen what one possible response is you take a case to the World Trade Organization multilaterally, and you force China to actually change its behavior. But it strikes me, just the last few weeks, right, we're seeing case after case after case of use of economic coercion. And so I think defensively, this isn't about full decoupling. And that was never, I think, General McMaster, you can tell us, but I don't think that was ever the plan under the Trump administration. My sense is
it was always a straw man argument.
Yeah, that it was always about selective decoupling in certain areas that we felt like opened up critical vulnerabilities that we had to protect against. And I think the Biden team is on a good start here, and they've got some fantastic people in this area. They've got an executive order out already about critical supply chains. The one thing that makes me a bit nervous is I haven't seen the multilateral effort to bring in key allies and partners, right? And you would think Japan would be among the first on the list, right? So I think one thing, just from my point of view on the defensive side, is let's make sure that if we're protecting supply chains, we're doing that across the US-Japan alliance and other key alliances in the region, because those vulnerabilities, they're not just American vulnerabilities. If our allies are being coerced using economic coercion, that's going to call in our treaty commitments even potentially. So I think we've got to make that defensive component more important. And then there has to be still that offensive positive agenda for the region. That's the one that's tougher, that I think everyone is struggling to come up with. But as you said, maybe there's something around, building back better on green energy, right, on infrastructure, whatever it is that the Biden team wants to use. I think they just need some positive message, which they can sell not so much for the US and Japan, but for the rest of the region, in particular Southeast Asia, to show the region that the US and Japan can still provide public goods. So I think the defensive part of the agenda is the easier one. That offensive positive agenda is going to take a little bit longer, I would think.
Right, and I might be a little bit biased about this, but I think President Trump's speech at APEC, in Da Nang, was a positive vision for the region. And the one line that I think Matt Pottinger came up with, was that it was really to not talk about China directly, but to talk about many belts and many roads, right? That this is really, not a choice between Washington and Beijing. It's a choice between sovereignty and servitude. And on supply chains, just to highlight your point a little bit more and to foot stomp it, because Nakayama-san made it as well. I don't think it's useful to talk about onshoring as much as it is to talk about the resiliency of supply chains, right? And we see that with computer chips right now, and the constraint that's putting on production of automobiles, for example, to highlight the danger, as if we needed more object lessons after COVID-19 and PPE and everything else. But thanks, Emma. What are your thoughts on this positive economic agenda?
I don't have a whole lot more to add than what's been said, other than to say that I think that Zach's point about the message, I do think that's important, but I think it's messaging it to the U.S. middle class is one of the obstacles we have here. And this is, President Biden's been, I think, pretty clear that we need to get it right here before we pursue things overseas. And that's why we saw, the divisions around the TPP. So I think that there's a messaging, there's some marketing that needs to be done to point out some of the positive benefits if we would go back into a multilateral agreement. And then just to say that, you've got to get it right to sell it to Congress as well. I mean, the US-Japan deal last year didn't have to go through Congress, but that's always going to be tricky to navigate that and all the disparate interests at play there. But if you make the right case to the US middle class and to the the US voters, then maybe that will trickle down into the representatives as well.
Good. Hey, I wonder, sure, yes, Nakayama-san.
Yeah, on this economic front, I think there's awareness in Japan that this competition with China is not just in terms of military, but sort of the technological front is the sort of the very important part of it. And that awareness has not totally penetrated the Japanese business sort of community yet. They're still sort of trying to find the right balance. And I think there's sort of a homework on our side that this sort of long-term competition with China is it has to be a whole sort of Japan effort, and the business community has to jump on a board as well. So if they jump on board, I think there's potential agendas like the supply chain security, of course, the infrastructure building, which has been one of the sort of the focus of Japan, could be sort of context in a very different way. So there are a potential and many agendas, but I think there has to be some shift in mindset within the Japanese business community.
I think in the United States as well, I think the outlier for us is Wall Street, right? It was in many ways, pouring dollars into investments in China that is really, in some ways, underwriting our own demise. Hey, what I would maybe recommend is a Hippocratic oath. I wonder what you think about this as a Hippocratic oath for doing business with China or allowing Chinese investments in our companies and so forth. And that would be to do no harm, obviously, to do no harm by either giving the CCP and China a unfair differential advantage over our free market economies in the emerging data-driven global economy, or an advantage militarily against us. Secondly, don't help them perfect their Orwellian technologically enabled surveillance police state. And third, don't compromise the long-term viability of our companies and our workers' jobs, right, for the lure of short-term profits. And of course, the reason why this should be an international pledge is because China will play us off against each other, right? And offer, market share that U.S. companies enjoy in China to Japanese companies and vice versa, or to German companies. So any concrete ideas about how we can come up with a multilateral relationship that can't be subverted by China, right? I think it's interesting that CPTPP, China's clamoring to get in. Well, they're not clamoring to get in to uphold its standards, right? They're getting in to actually subvert that organization like they do other international organizations and agreements. But any thoughts for a multilateral agreement beyond the U.S.-Japan relationship that might help preserve our competitiveness economically?
I think part of what's hard here is it's not clear that the governments are the right ones to lead some of this conversation. And I think we're maybe just getting to the point where businesses are willing to push this debate forward a little bit. So, a model that I've thought of a little bit and others have suggested is corporate social responsibility, right? Where now actually companies have a responsibility, and shareholders actually can hold them to account for this, for making sure that they uphold certain things that are important that maybe don't hit the bottom line, right? And I think expanding how we think about corporate social responsibility is an important piece of this. And I think it's harder when it comes to some of the dual use technology concerns, which might not fit so well into that. But think about Xinjiang, right? I mean, I think if you're a company, this is pretty clearly, in my mind, something that would fall within corporate social responsibility, right? And we're seeing Nike, H&M get hit every day, right? And I think the numbers are just going to grow of companies that are affected in this way. And unfortunately, what's happened so far is, Beijing's been able to go after companies kind of one at a time, right? You go after American Airlines and United Airlines, and the list is long.
Kill one to scare 100, just like you go after Australia with the same idea in mind, right? Kill one to scare 100.
Exactly, and I think the problem is, if it's governments asking companies to link together, the companies probably are not going to do it. So I think this has to happen a bit organically within the business communities. And my sense is we're starting to see slowly bits of change in this direction, but it's certainly not at the pace that I think a lot of us would hope for.
So Zack, if I could direct to Emma. Emma, I know Congress is working hard on this, right? There's the Strategic Act that's in draft. How is Congress thinking about insulating U.S. companies from the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I am not familiar with the intimate drafts of legislation that are being circulated right now, particularly because I don't really focus on trade. But I will say that there's been, a tremendous surge in interest and mostly concern about China. I mean, even this is taking a step back, but in the time that I've been in Washington, which is over 15 years now, we've seen, from all the way, the whole political spectrum, right, from the right to the left, become concerned about China, and sometimes for different reasons. Sometimes there are commercial reasons that you mentioned. Sometimes it's more human rights based. So I do think that we're going to see more action out of Congress. I mean, if you look at the National Defense Authorization Act from last year, you're going to see a lot of language that may point the direction in where Congress could head from here.
Great. And Nakayama, so I'd like to begin with you with this final question for all of us, because we're running out of time, sadly. But we haven't talked that as much about a point that Zack hit hard on, which is really defense and the ability to establish deterrence by denial, right, across the Indo-Pacific and Northeast Asia, in particular, vis-a-vis Taiwan, which is coming under greater threat. And of course, we want to convince the People's Liberation Army that they can't accomplish their objectives for the use of force in the region. But we also want to convince the Chinese Communist Party that they can't accomplish their objectives with other coercive means, right, below the level that might elicit a military response. And I'm thinking about maritime militias in the Senkakus or in the South China Sea. What I'd like to ask each of you, beginning with Nakayama-san and then to Zack, and then we'll end with Emma, what are your recommendations, again, in the spirit of opportunities to improve our defense capabilities, our deterrent capabilities, and our ability to preserve peace in the region as critical allies?
Well, thank you. Sort of important point. And if you look at this 2+2 statement, which was issued in Tokyo, there was a sentence about Taiwan. And I don't think Taiwan was mentioned in the previous 2+2 statement. And it tells us a lot about how the situation has changed in this region. And I think it was good that both countries realize the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. But more and more, we're facing a situation where some contingency might happen. Is there a dialogue on what Japan can do in the moments of Taiwan contingency. There hasn't been a serious talk about it. If it actually happens, and if Japan is not forthcoming in playing an active role, I think it might signal sort of an alliance crisis moment for the alliance. Are we really prepared to play an active role in case of a Taiwan contingency? We haven't really started that conversation within Japan yet. So we don't have yet to sort of bring something to Washington, because I think initially we have to start a conversation on our side. And I think this conversation has to be sort of kicked off, has to be initiated on the political, by the political leaders. It's not about, scholars, think tankers. We've sort of, are already engaging in a conversation, but we need a serious political dialogue on it. Right? So I think it's critically important for us that to realize that situation has changed, and U.S. is asking more in terms of Japanese contribution to the alliance. So I think it is critically important for us to start that conversation. It may take some time, but I think there are awareness in Japan that we have to start doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't agree more with what Nakayama-san just said. I think the big contingency that is most likely to lead us into a major conflict is Taiwan. And let's be very honest, Japan might be the only US ally that would actually play a particularly active role in that conflict. And frankly, I don't think either Japan or the United States knows what to expect of the other right now. And that means we're not doing a particularly good job of sending deterrent messages to Beijing. So if I had to pick one thing, agree 100% that joint planning on Taiwan would be the number one item. I think a second item that I'll raise is just as you said, General McMaster, right? I think the theory of victory here on the military side increasingly is deterrence by denial. And this is one area where I actually think the Trump team got a lot of broad agreement from both sides of the aisle that deterrence by denial within the first island chain is something we should be focused on. And that means having more missile forces that can strike assets within the first island chain. And we just don't have enough now. And we're seeing the Australians, the Japanese, the Americans, and others try and buy all kinds of different systems. Seems to me that this is a pretty obvious area where we should be doing a major co-development program to drive down cost, increase capability, and increase interoperability, and make the Chinese targeting problem even harder. If they don't know whose systems are operating where, it's going to be hard for them to try and drive wedges between our alliances by targeting, say, only US forces, right? So if I had to pick a second item to add to Nakayama-san's, it would be, let's go ahead and finally build these land-based missile forces, and let's do it together in a way that makes sense and is the most efficient that we can find. Thanks so much.
Great, Zach. Thanks. Emma, you have the last word.
Sure. Let me just, I'll take a little bit of a different approach to this. I think that the US-Japan alliance, we need to be talking more frankly and at more length with one another on some core issues, some of which were mentioned. On aligning our missile defense priorities in terms of extended deterrence and what that means, and get that dialogue a little bit more serious. And then once you are focused on that sort of core bilaterally, we need to expand, and we need to make sure that we have a network of alliances and partners in the region. I mentioned South Korea already, but it bears repeating. We need to get that piece in place. And I hope that the United States has some good ideas about how to pressure or facilitate or make the right conditions so that we can get that piece right. Beyond that, we both have great cooperation with Australia. We can push those cooperative efforts forward. Things like building capacity for Southeast Asian countries, I think, is also really important, and will make our presence felt more in that region. And even reaching beyond, reaching to Europe, developing some more NATO partnerships can be in everyone's interest. So getting the core conversation right including about Japan acquiring a straight capability of its own. We need to be having honest conversations there, and then branching out with other partners throughout the region.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, it is a great privilege for me to be the Japan chair, a great privilege to host you. I think it was a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot. So Ms. Chanlett-Avery, Professor Nakayama, and Dr. Cooper, I can't thank you enough for your insights and for joining us this evening. It's going to be a great visit, I think, with Prime Minister Suga, and I think you've really helped our viewers understand better what the possibilities are associated with it. Thank you so much, and take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.